Welcome to the second episode of METCO in Review, the TV series. My name is Celeste Andrade. I'm both the host and the producer for the series. I'm pleased today to have two guests who are very knowledgeable about public education in general and METCO in particular. Dr. Michael Harvey, principal of Belmont High School, and Dr. Susan Eaton, research director at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at the Harvard Law School. Michael Harvey earned his doctorate from the University of Massachusetts in Lowell in school leadership and has served over 16 years in leadership positions in schools. Dr. Eaton earned her degree from Harvard's Graduate School of Education and is the author of two books, one of which, the other, Boston Busing Story, is a qualitative study of the METCO program, and with Gina Chirigino, forgive my pronunciation, Gina, if you're listening, co-authored METCO Merits More, very fascinating study of METCO, which was recently published by the Pioneer Research Institute and the Houston Institute. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Mike, can you please give our viewers a brief profile of the METCO program as it operates in Belmont?
Sure. We have about 120 students in the METCO program, residents of the city of Boston. They attend Belmont public schools from kindergarten all the way up through the 12th grade, and so they receive the exact same education that a resident of Belmont student would have, except that they're making quite a long commute in the morning to attend the Belmont Public Schools. Diane Wiltshire is our METCO director, who is in charge of the METCO program district-wide, as well as some other support staff and counselors that are in the different schools to assist the students.
Can you talk a little bit, Michael, about something you told me about in your office, the typical day of a METCO student coming to Belmont?
Sure. And it depends on the grade level, but the METCO students are going to be getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to make at least an hour commute to Belmont. It's a very long day, and then to stay through the entire school day, and then if students are involved in extracurricular activities, it extends that day even longer, and then we're looking at students that are probably arriving home sometime around 8 o'clock in the evening. It's a huge commitment on the part of our students in the METCO program to be full participants in the Belmont Public Schools. I think I told you then, I have a special place in my heart for those kids, because I actually commuted like that in high school as well, and know it's a real, as I said, sense of dedication to actually to want to do that for a better education.
That's right. Really cuts into the free time for a teenager.
Sure, absolutely.
Susan, can you add to that description of what life as a METCO student is like, based on your book, The Other Boston Busing Story?
Sure. What I found in talking to folks who had graduated from the program and who had gone through the program as children and teenagers, some of whom did go to the Belmont Public Schools. I mean, they did talk a lot about the commute to the school and how they often had to get up very early in the morning and ride the bus. But after time, especially if the children started when they were quite young, which is the preference of the METCO program, to start the children in the suburban school districts as early as possible, the students talked about that just sort of became the way that life was, and they didn't really question it very much. And then oftentimes when they got a little older, they started to notice more that other kids didn't have as long of a ride to school, but again, it was something that they, got themselves accustomed to.
Why do you think, Susan, parents were willing to plan years in advance to be on a waiting list for METCO, for something that might happen 5 years hence?
Well, it was very interesting. I mean, there are kind of two levels of answers to that question that I got from folks. I mean, and what students' understanding of it was, as Mike was saying, was for a better education. That was kind of the offhand reason for why the students understood why they were going and what their understanding was of why their parents did it. But if you kind of go a little bit below the surface, I mean, what you find is that the parents also had this longer term goal, which was to give their students more opportunities in the long run, to put them in a place that was different from what they saw every day in their neighborhoods. Now, there's this stereotype about urban neighborhoods that they're full of violence and drugs and danger. And you know, what I found in talking to people and also living in many urban neighborhoods and knowing people who lived in urban neighborhoods, there's a lot of variation. There were a lot of neighborhoods in Boston that were very healthy, constructive places that the students actually preferred to live in and chose to live in after they finished METCO. But what METCO did, and what the parents seemed to understand that it would do in the long run, was get students acclimated to a different type of environment, to a suburban environment that in many ways would approximate the type of work environment or higher education environment that they wanted their kids to be able to succeed in and enter in with much less self-consciousness and fear and intimidation.
Thank you.
So,
Michael, can you talk a little bit about how kids adjust, METCO kids adjust in Belmont to being in high school with kids so different from their own background?
Well, as Susan said, the preference from us is to have students start the METCO program as early as possible, as early as kindergarten. So it's kind of an interesting thing where the adjustment is probably about the same as any other student in the Belmont Public Schools. They really do move as a group from the elementary schools through the middle school and into the high school, so that you know, that those students, for most of those students, Belmont is all they've known as far as public education. We do have some students that enter the high school as you know, for the first time in the METCO program. They enter the program in 9th grade, and they have an adjustment to make. It's a big jump. We pay very close attention to those students who are coming from a middle school setting in the Boston Public Schools and are starting out their METCO experience at Belmont High. The expectations are very different. The climate is very different. The amount of responsibility I think that we give students is a different expectation. So there are a lot of adjustments that students have to make in that respect.
Looking back on my own life, when I went to a high school that was primarily a Caucasian white high school, it was a major adjustment for me that I didn't really get over until 2 or 3 years after I left the high school. I really was constraining, personally constraining. Okay. Susan, can you please talk about the report METCO Merits More and why you feel that METCO merits more attention than it's getting right now?
METCO is
It's a long, interesting report. I'm only going to give you a couple of minutes. It's going to be hard.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to mention as well, I don't know if I mentioned this in our previous discussion, Celeste, but it's interesting to note that the two organizations that co-published this brief, one is the Pioneer Institute, the other is the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, are usually on opposite sides of political issues. The Pioneer Institute could be characterized as a much more conservative, more Republican-oriented think tank, and our institute really comes from a more of a progressive, more maybe Democratic-oriented, but we both are in agreement on our support for the METCO program. And the reason that is because the program provides families a choice that's different from the kind of the status quo that exists and that has been created by a long history of racial discrimination, of government policies, and of habits over many, many decades, long before the parents and grandparents, even of the students in the public schools, were even born. And so the METCO program intervenes in that process in that structure of inequality that exists still in our region. And this report was meant to kind of let folks know about this program, the purpose of it, the goals of it, the history of it, because it has been around, as I said, for more than 40 years now, and it is not a program that's well understood even by, I think, by ordinary folks in suburban districts where the students are coming. And we thought that it was an important kind of contribution to just inform people, especially in this time of scarce resources, you know, what the tax dollars were going to and what kind of results the program was having. we were able to get some data from the state on achievement levels of METCO students. And what we found was that typically METCO students perform far better than their African American and Latino peers in urban districts. And that's not surprising, but on the other hand, we're also finding that the METCO students are doing very close to the state average on some of the most important academic measures as measured by the MCAS, the standardized tests that Judge was. But I think the most important finding in the report was that the graduation rates of METCO students are just through the roof. I mean, we're talking about rates of 94, 95%, which is even 10, 12 percentage points oftentimes above the state average graduation rate. And so that is an excellent achievement, especially considering the things that Mike talked about, some of the adjustment issues that students have to go through, the long commutes that students have to go through. And that is on its face a huge success. And because of that, and because of the promising data on student achievement, which I think could be studied a little bit more deeply as well, and because of its support generally within suburban districts among educators such as Mike who see the value of the program, both for the students who participate and the students who are in the suburban district, we argue that it should be getting more support. It certainly should not be cut back. And we think that educators and elected leaders should get together and really study for the long term some possibility for expanding the program to other challenged urban districts to give students in those schools opportunities to go to other districts.
Yeah. Thank you. I have two questions. First, can you share the website where people can get a copy of your report?
Yeah, you can get it through our website, which is www.charleshamiltonhouston.org.
Great. Michael, would you like to share some insight on why you think METCO has to struggle for funding every year, year after year after year for 45 years?
I wish I had the answer to that. And I think that's the great challenge to the program at this point, where METCO is, the state is not funding METCO at 100% of what the receiving districts are spending per pupil. And that, in a time of limited resources, causes quite a few issues for, in every community, I think, that accepts METCO students, and it sets off, internal political discussions and debates and sometimes anger within a community, and I think that a lot of that would be taken care of if the state legislature would step up and actually fund the program appropriately.
Okay, I agree 2,000%. I know parents today have some choices. One of the things that's challenged METCO on one level is the whole issue of charter schools, which became popular some years ago. Michael, can you talk a little bit about why a parent might choose a charter school rather than METCO, and what the advantages and disadvantages are of the two choices?
Yeah, I would think the motivations for METCO and a charter school are very similar. I think that's the question of choice, of trying to provide better opportunities educationally for your child is what parents who send their children to either are looking for. And I don't have this information, but I would be wouldn't be surprised to find that that there is probably a high percentage of people who are on the METCO wait list who are also applying for charter schools as well, to try and looking for those educational opportunities. I think the main difference is going to be distance that we're talking about here, is that METCO students are going to be heading out to the suburbs, and that takes, as I talked about, that time commitment, that experience. Although, I think in a lot of ways that experience of commuting, that kind of distance every day, also helps a child to grow up quite a bit. You become quite more worldly in doing that, I think. And so that's an educational experience in and of itself. And I think that's that travel piece is definitely one of the key differences that I would see. I'd also think about the idea of having your child become accustomed to the suburban world is definitely another piece that would draw people towards METCO over a charter school.
You think the average charter school is really competitive with suburban school like Belmont or Wellesley or?
Not at the moment, it's not.
Yeah.
So
METCO might get the edge in that comparison.
I think so.
I'd like to look backwards because I like to look at the law. I like to look at history. I like to think of myself as a student of American history, and I know. Well, let me not load the discussion here. Let us look at education law in the 19th century for a few minutes. Let's change direction here and move from the 21st century to the 19th century. METCO Merits More, the report that Susan and Gina co-authored, does touch on history. I should say now that no one at this table is an attorney. I am not, Dr. Harvey is not, and Dr. Eaton is not. But we all vote, we all have an interest in law in this country, and it was interesting to me to learn that the concept of separate but equal was born not in Arkansas, not in Mississippi, but in the state of Massachusetts in the 19th century in a case called Roberts v. Boston, 1849, am I correct?
Yeah.
Susan, granted that you're not an attorney, would you be willing to share a couple of thoughts about the evolution from separate versus separate but equal, Plessy to Brown? Just a couple of sentences.
Sure. I mean, I think that, and the reason we went back in history is a lot of what Celeste says is because it provides a context for the METCO program and why the METCO program exists and how, and is part of the story and why these patterns of racial segregation and economic segregation persist and are particularly pronounced in the metro Boston area. And I liked the way that you phrased that, Celeste, talking about where separate but equal was born, because in the North, and in Boston in particular, we tend to pride ourselves to some extent on our kind of our racial liberalism, if you will, and our ideals of equality. But you're right, the 1849 case Roberts v. Boston, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, affirmed the idea of racially segregated schools. This was following years of protest and petitions by African American parents who wanted racial segregation within the schools to end. They were rebuffed by the court, and then in 1855, interestingly, our Massachusetts lawmakers, in defiance of the court, really passed a law prohibiting racial segregation. But in spite of that law, it really was not enforced, and racial segregation persisted, as we know, for many years in a variety of forms and for a variety of reasons and stemming from a variety of causes. And then in 1965, the legislature took a very bold move and passed something that was called the Racial Imbalance Act. And that was the act that kind of provided the framework for the eventual creation of the METCO program. And the Racial Imbalance Act basically said that students who were in school districts that were effectively segregated should have the opportunity to move to a school district that didn't have those same levels of racial segregation. And so that was something that enabled the METCO program to come into being. But it's important to understand that the METCO program emerged just not out of the blue because of some, just because of some civil rights era in the 1960s. It was actually something that was born from, more than a century of racial segregation. And again, as you pointed out, I think you mentioned the federal law, Separate but Equal, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which really coined the term separate but equal and affirmed segregation, and then wasn't overturned until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which, interestingly again, applied really in many ways, and at least in practical terms, to the South and to a type of segregation that existed in the South called de jure segregation. And that was segregation that was in the law, written into the law, that said blacks and whites can't go to the same schools, can't go to the same swimming pools, can't sit in the same sections of public buses, things like that. The segregation that we had in Massachusetts was often termed de facto segregation. And then some people argue, especially because of the history here in Massachusetts and other places, that our segregation was also de jure segregation. But unfortunately, the power and reach of the Brown decision didn't go far enough and wasn't strong enough to reach the North. And so we ended up with being the most segregated region in the country, while now the South is actually still the most racially integrated among its schools in the nation.
Wow. Thank
Sorry,
you,
that was
Susan.
more than a few sentences.
That's all right. No, thank you very much. That was good. That's very good. That's very good. 1954. Well, I know I was 10 years old, so probably you weren't even thought of, you two. Brown. Okay. Well, Susan, for our viewers who may not be familiar with the details of the METCO program, how would you compare the busing situation in Boston in the 70s with METCO transportation as it exists today?
Well, METCO obviously is, and that's why I titled my book "The Other Boston Busing Story," because METCO is a story of, you know, bus transportation, which was peaceful, which was voluntary, and which wasn't always easy for the students who, you know, chose the METCO program, but certainly was much more successful for a variety of reasons than the desegregation tumult that we think of when people think of Boston sometimes.
I remember vividly what happened with Boston in the 70s. Boston just blew up in anger and violence. It was in the news practically every day. And it's amazing to me that METCO has gone on for 45 years without one serious incident of violence in the busing part of it or in any other part of the program. And I think that's truly amazing and to be noted, that peaceful change can happen that benefits people, not only 10 or 20 or 30 people, but thousands of people have benefited from the METCO program over the years. Michael, I have another question for you. If it doesn't, let's see, based on your, oh yes, I remember. Given that METCO is a good program, it serves 120 people at the high school right now, what if the program were tripled in size or quadrupled in size? Could the Belmont public school system absorb that many new kids?
Not with the current funding. That would be the big
yeah.
hang-up. I think, you know, actually to just say it's 120 district-wide. We have about 45 students in the METCO program at Belmont High. You know, could we take another 120 students? It would be a tight squeeze just physically for the building. You know, but I think we could get larger. That's for sure.
You could get larger.
Sure. I don't know if we could double or triple, but we could definitely take more students.
Given the funding.
Right.
Given
right.
funding increase.
With adequate funding, sure.
Okay. Susan, a recent Boston Globe article was June 12, 2011. In that article, 19 children on one street in Dorchester were going to 15 different schools. Can you comment on that? I mean, what's happening in Boston schools right now that on one street you have 19 kids and 15 going to 15 different schools in Boston? I mean,
yeah,
what are the educational
I read that. I read those pieces, and I think that they fail to address some of the central issues at the heart of this kind of what they termed as a maze. And that was unfortunate. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, wow, isn't this silly? Oh, and look at all the costs and whatever. But the level of inequality that gave rise to what is basically the choice program, in the controlled choice program in Boston, and the METCO program, and whatever other private school choices parents might choose to make as well for their children, is at the heart of this. If the Boston public schools were all, you know, of equal quality and we're all of high quality, then we wouldn't have to do this. In the perfect world, there wouldn't be a METCO program. In the perfect world, you wouldn't have to have a controlled choice program. But we don't live in the perfect world, and so we need to go through all of these kind of seemingly illogical policy choices and changes and adjustments to ensure that students have an opportunity to receive a high quality education. I'm sure that there can be adjustments and changes to the system. That's not my area of expertise, but to just kind of, you know, take issue with what they call a maze and not really get at the heart of some of these really tough problems seems to me to be a little irresponsible.
That's a good comment. I tend to agree. And these issues in Boston are very, very complex and complicated. I personally have no easy solution.
I think it's important to say as well, and that's why we're very careful in this report to refer to the school districts in Boston as a challenged school district, an often overwhelmed school district, because while educators can certainly control some of the things that there's, you know, there are challenges that are facing their students academically, and I'm sure there's always areas and room for improvement in any school district, the more affluent suburban districts as well. The types of challenges and the levels of challenges that educators in Boston face are simply not faced by suburban school districts in any concentrated manner. So it's very important to continually repeat that over and over again. Not saying that educators should just be taken off the hook for whatever problems and flaws they
but
might
housing,
have.
economics,
exactly. High poverty.
If there's a household has enough money to live.
Exactly. I mean, those are all things that, you know, are foisted upon the schools and that the educators have to deal with, and, you know, nobody is equipped to deal with the level of social problems faced in our urban centers. And so that, to me, is at the root of a lot of the inequalities that we see.
Yeah, inequity. Okay. Well, you answered that question very well. Thank you very much. Mike, please, based on your experience, share your recommendations about improving. Oh, that's too big a question, Celeste. let me back up. The question was improving equity in urban education. That's too. let me rephrase that, please. Let me rephrase that. I'm going to give you both an opportunity for some concluding comments. And if you want to talk about urban education any further, please do. But I'm not going to put anyone on the spot for that. But would you please share some concluding comments?
Sure. I think
about METCO.
You know, the answer to the last question that Susan had about really what, you know, we're looking at here through the METCO program is an effort to address hundreds of years of inequality in American society, and this program has been in effect for 40 years, but relative to the history of racism and inequality in America, that's a drop in the bucket. And so this program, although we say 40 years is, you know, a long time for us, it really hasn't even started to scratch the surface, and I think we really need to continue the program and definitely to expand it to other districts around and try and expand the size. You know, I think you know, that's really the only way we're actually going to be able to make a society that's truly accepting of everyone. So.
Thank you, Michael. Susan?
Well, I would certainly agree with what Mike says 100%. And I'd also like to add that I think maybe when we look at the METCO program, we can think about some of its underlying goals and underlying values, which you know, articulated really well, which is to reduce inequalities and try to get kids on the same par there and give them equal access to high quality education and experiences. And I do think that it would be great to expand the METCO program, but I also think that it would be great to think about other ways that we can expand that vision to other things. For example, creating summer programs that really connect kids who live in different places and allow them, and there's a big movement now to kind of get all these kind of privileged kids to go into urban areas and do service, and I think that's a great thing, and I would never say that that's a bad thing, but I also think it's important that children come together as equals, on an equal footing to participate in some kind of task with a common goal. And I think that that's when you really start to get real change happening. And I also think it might be worthy to look at the charter school model and magnet school models to think about how to, say, take several districts at the same time and bring the students together to a school, into one school, so that you didn't have, you know, black kids coming up to a white school. So those are all things to think about in the future.
Those are very good suggestions, Susan. I thank you for your thoughts, your insight, your experience. I thank both of you for coming today, for sharing your time from a busy schedule. I know you're both very busy. So thanks from the bottom of my heart. METCO thanks you, and I thank you. This is Celeste Andrade signing off for METCO in Review from the Belmont Media Center. This show will be broadcast on the Belmont Media Center channel, probably 29.9 Comcast, and will appear on the Belmont Media Center website, www.belmontmedia.org. Thank you and good afternoon.